Hello everyone, today we talk about the British air raid on the Italian naval base of Taranto in November 1940. And this action, the Regia Marina, Italy's Royal Navy, endured a catastrophic setback in what was deemed its most secure and heavily defended harbor. It's about time to talk not just more about World War II, but also its complexity, the difficulty of getting clear, objective judgments about specific military topics, and consequently also an equilibrated political take from the war. There is a tendency, at least there was, I remember military history visualized years ago, making a video about the British raid on Taranto, essentially minimizing the Italian losses. Basically, they just talked math, right? How many ships were lost and how in the broader defeat, this was something relatively minor. This is actually the direct opposite, which is even more jarring, paradoxically, considering that Italy does actually suffer of a pretty brutal and frankly unfair sort of belittlement of its military capacity and performance during World War II. Well, this was definitely not the case, and so it's not much just an exception, more than much, because objectively the Italian armed forces did not perform particularly well, in case you didn't notice, but everything must be framed in a somehow broader Clausewitzian understanding of the broader political background. Most of the World War II analysis stemmed from some kind of Darwinian evolutionary kind of approach, reminiscent of 19th century ethno-nationalistic rivalries between various European countries, and even with a very heavy let's say distortion of events on the basis of narratives that were actually quite useful, for example, during the Cold War, to settle matters for all the different countries involved, right? In this case, the Italians were seen as basically incapable of fighting, but, after all, kind of cool, warm people as far as touristic hosts during your vacations. The Japanese and the Germans were this, highly competent, chivalric, noble, honorable militaries that have to be feared of and that did nothing particularly wrong, or at least, that after all you like in the end, and you have to sort of square things up in order to make them look better, even though they were also, in many aspects, incompetent and incapable, as also you can actually see the Allies in different circumstances. One reading of this is, let's understand that in warfare hardly anything gets ever as you planned, and that in general, until 1942, you can argue that most countries in the war had probably not reached the level of preparedness, let's say, for waging it. Right, this was true also for the Germans, and the Italians essentially bailed out of the war in a particularly politically catastrophic way, exactly in the moment in which they were starting, for example, to produce better means, and they were sort of toughening up in ways that would have at least been seen in particular context of dramatic resistance, for example, even though this happened in certain Nazi-fascist context, as much as also, the Italian resistance actually was pretty important, way more important than the French one, that, however, has been, magnified for, in that sense, also different political reasons and or alignments. So I think this lens of World War II studying and interpretation is the most favored one, because every time I make this kind of rhetoric, there is always, a bunch of people whose comment I hide that say, oh, it's true because, actually, the Nazis were right, this kind of things. They don't get what it means to actually study, to revise World War II in a military historically, and also politically historically objective way. Which is essentially a topic that, as a whole, I think most scholarship does not even properly approach at all, meaning that our current historiographies haven't properly studied World War II. you have all these people often coming from channels like, I don't know, those military historical, say military institutions that invite over, sometimes it's military personnel and or other people who receive scholarships in their institutions that are always sort of self-publicitary, self-promoting in some ways, and dispatch themselves for the experts on World War II just because they publish books on it. That per se, this doesn't mean that it's all bad, but that per se has literally nothing to do with any kind of military historical accuracy and competence in a broader sense. Besides, there are also this very parochial, provincial, insular mentalities that completely blind judgment, and when it comes to be more objective and precise. Naturally, I'm not a channel dedicated to World War II, but as I also explained in recent videos, I am widely expanding on the topic because I'm actually quite passionate World War II, especially aerial warfare, for reasons that, as a medievalist, I don't want to even start discussing, because in general, of course, I'm interested in lots of things from quite a long time, even before I became a historian, and that heavily contributed also to my own specific vision, although we're not talking about family memories and certain worldviews that definitely affected my military historical view in many ways, especially from a moral, personal, and cultural point of view. So today we will proceed by that usual observation of all the things that sort of went wrong from both sides, because it's way more exemplificative of sort of human shortcoming as an interpretation of also the actual successes that occurred, like in this case, the British case. There are so many different things at a time, incredibly complex systems that you can't quite simply predict, but that you can try your best to dominate. And this is essentially what brought to this astonishing British success at the detriment of fascist Italy, during also a very delicate moment during the war, where basically Britain was left alone in Europe to fight against the Axis. So the major Italian disaster can be summarized in this fashion. 3 of the Regia Marina key battleships were rendered inoperable by sluggish, antiquated torpedo bombers. Already this is fundamental. Then, as we will see probably in a few weeks, the Italians responded to the British with the raid on Alexandria of Egypt that was actually in scale comparable to the raid on Taranto. And that is, in fact, one of the greatest actions in World War II in its own regard. And that, if anything, tells what the Italians were good at and how sort of actually balanced the two powers really were. Consider that the British had very sort of still also quite openly racistically sense of overwhelming superiority over the Italians, and they counted on knocking out the Italian Royal Navy quite early in the war, right, in the first year. Instead, basically, the Italian Royal Navy remained there until the armistice with the Allies, and there was no way essentially to take it out. And actually also the various Allied operations, including eventually the landings in southern Italy, were heavily influenced properly by the fear of the direct intervention of the Italian naval forces in those circumstances. Again, we really have to begin all of this. We will see this in many other videos. I really want to talk more about also the Germans and the Italians in North Africa. I'm expanding a lot also on British warfare because I think it's so important and underrated in many aspects, even though it's not like the British overly performed during World War II, but that's also what actually matters in many ways in the various details, and looking at everybody's failure to compare how eventually the difference is made on the ground, or at least on water in this case. So today we detail the sequence of events identifying the accountable factors for the Italian calamity and the British triumph. A little word about Taranto, because here we're looking at, also as far as Western power, something incredibly important. We'll talk. I've never made, for example, as a medievalist, many videos about southern Italy, or also for the historical regional series, Puglia in this case. There is a lot to that. Also in early, throughout all the eras from ancient to modern, that matters. And just a little figure, during the Cold War, NATO held a steadfast strategic belief that should a military clash erupt with Warsaw Pact forces, a lone United States aircraft carrier positioned in the Gulf of Taranto, accompanied by a handful of support vessels, would be sufficient to safeguard the entire southeastern Mediterranean region effectively. And this belief was pretty darn right? Taranto alone basically allowed for the dominance of the Mediterranean. And this in many ways was true also back in the day of World War II. This belief, by the way, after the war was reinforced by NATO's 1962 Maritime Strategy Review, which highlighted the Gulf of Taranto's deep waters, reaching in some parts depths of up to 2 kilometers in some areas. But the most amazing aspect of the Gulf is the fact that it has 2 internal seas inside the Gulf. It's truly unique. There is no other major, at least naval base in the world that has that specific geographical physiognomy. In any case, this was ideal for carrier operations, allowing for rapid deployment and maneuverability against Soviet naval forces after World War II. This belief was rooted, of course, in the Gulf's unique geographical features, including its deep waters and proximity to key maritime routes, which are still very crucial in, say, today's NATO doctrine. You know that the choke points like the Strait of Messina, the one of Otranto, the Channel of Sicily are all radically strategical passages. The most important in the Western Mediterranean. And this characteristic allowed from Taranto a single carrier group to project power across the Ionian Sea and control access to the Adriatic as well as the Eastern Mediterranean. The Gulf of Taranto's strategic significance was equally acknowledged during World War II. By the fall of 1940, where the raid on the base took place following the war's early months, Italy was by now embroiled in war on 2 fronts. All right. In June 1940, Italy had entered the war against Britain and the United States. I made a video about fascist Italy that sort of ends with the declaration of war. If anything, we'll talk more about Rome, especially during World War II. The theaters we're talking about here, of course, are North Africa and the Balkans, because Mussolini had, by the way, at this point just declared war on Greece. We are on October the 28th, 1940. We'll talk about the campaign of Greece. It is also one of the most misunderstood, probably, in World War II. Essentially, whatever happens, look, the Italians sucked because they lost against the Greece. But first of all, they didn't lose, actually. And actually, they offered the Wehrmacht, actually, with an enormous opportunity to secure the east flanks of Barbarossa, and basically by the time the Germans attacked the Greek rear in Thessaly, the Greek front line was collapsing under, if anything, the sheer numbers of the Italian forces. But we will see, of course, the Italian failures in that campaign, in Epirus in particular, in perhaps another video. Taranto's port, due to its strategic location, allowed the Regia Marina to exert influence in both theaters of war. All right. Within the expansive harbor of this Apulian city, the Italian Supreme Command had gathered the 1st Naval Squadron under the command of Admiral Inigo Campioni. This was a powerful fleet, right? Italians were pretty actually well placed, navally-wise. And the squadron consisted of 6 battleships, the Andrea Doria, Caio Duilio, Conte di Cavour, Giulio Cesare, Littorio, and Vittorio Veneto, the last 2 having been recently commissioned, 7 heavy cruisers, Bolzano, Fiume, Gorizia, Pola, Trento, Trieste, and Zara, 2 light cruisers, Luigi di Savoia, Duca degli Abruzzi, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, and a formidable group of 13 destroyers. The fleet's anchorage in Taranto's Mar Grande, so the bigger sea within the Gulf, a naturally sheltered basin, was protected by a double breakwater system. But its shallow depth of 12 to 15 meters posed a unique challenge for defense against torpedo attacks, as standard torpedoes risk striking the seabed as well. The harbor's shallow depth was further complicated by its uneven seabed topography, with depths varying by up to 3 meters in some areas, necessitating precise torpedo calibration to avoid premature detonation, as documented in the British naval engineering reports from the same 1940, witnessing to the awareness of the Italian foes of this specific characteristic, in this case helping the deployment of the Italian naval squadron in Taranto. The Italian strategy designated the Taranto fleet as a fleet in being, so-called, that is to say, a latent threat that did not necessitate aggressive maneuvers, essentially by sheer deterrence and the magnitude of, in this sense, naval power that this fleet evidently had. The Italians could command most movements in the Mediterranean. The British Royal Navy's technological edge, despite having fewer ships, outclassed, however, Italy's discouraging bold actions from the same Italian side, which also caused the aforementioned strategic balance between the Axis and the Allies in the Mediterranean as it progresses in that sort of ambiguous stalemate throughout most of the war. There is a very interesting naval warfare going on, aside from this aeronaval one, in the Mediterranean, different battles between the Italians and the British that we will cover in the Terminate videos. The Royal Navy's, so the British Royal Navy's superiority was enhanced by its advanced fire control systems and the integration of air reconnaissance, which allowed for precise targeting and rapid response to Italian movements. British fire control systems, such as the Admiralty Fire Control Table Mark I, introduced in 1939, enabled real-time ballistic calculations for naval gunnery, achieving targeting accuracy improvement of 15% over Italian systems, according to Royal Navy technical assessments. There were also some Italian issues from a technical point of view in the accuracy of naval theory, but we will see this better in other videos. Nevertheless, this still forced the Royal Navy into a draining naval containment effort that, caused by this also Italian preponderance, taxed both personnel and resources, which hindered, in fact, the same Royal Navy ability to focus forces against Italy's chief strategic goal, which was at the time securing supply lines to overseas war zones. Right, as we've seen, North Africa and Balkans, particularly shielding convoys carrying troops, equipment, and supplies to the former, as North Africa was the most important theater of the Mediterranean. This strategy did not rule out the possibility of Italian ships launching risky raids against British convoys or isolated enemy units. Another crucial aspect here is the Regia Marina's lack of air support. Two critical factors shaped the Italian Royal Navy's strategic decisions: the absence of naval aviation and aircraft carriers, and the lack of radar, whether ship-based or shore-based. Italy entered war without a proven air naval coordination doctrine or a dedicated naval air force aside from a new reconnaissance seaplanes. This is even more painful considering that the Italians had at the time one of the top physics and mathematics minds in the world, but effectively lacked resources to implement their technological achievements. At some point, we will also look from a military point of view. The Regia Marina's reliance on the Regia Aeronautica, that is the Italian Air Force, for air support was hampered by jurisdictional disputes, with the Air Force prioritizing land-based operations and allocating only 12 obsolete CR-32 fighters to Taranto's defense in November 1942. I don't know if you're passionate about World War II planes, but you know that the CR-32 is, here we are early in the war, of course, so the war is still sort of less performing models. The same British Swordfish wasn't this absolute masterpiece of, firepower projection. In any case, the CR-32 fighters, fighter bombers, with a maximum speed of 356 kilometers per hour and armed with only two 7.7 millimeters machine guns, were outclassed by the same British Swordfish's maneuverability and ASV radar capabilities, as noted in the same Italian Air Force operational logs from 1940. So these things were, by the way, known largely from also pre-war studies, general knowledge, spying, and just obvious public information that still existed. This significant oversight would prove costly for both the Italian Navy and the Air Force. The Navy, in particular, received air support that was perpetually delayed and restricted to roughly 200-kilometer radius from an airfield. So if you have only 12 fighters, well, you have this enormous naval force essentially exposed to any larger aerial attack. Beyond this 200 kilometers range, by the way, the Navy was thus consistently vulnerable to enemy assaults to begin with. Conversely, the British fleet, equipped with aircraft carriers, enjoyed greater operational flexibility, continuous and prompt long-range defense against Axis aircraft, and a well-coordinated offensive array of reconnaissance planes, torpedo bombers, and bombers. Naturally, the entire political, doctrinal, strategical causes to this, of course, also the reduced German naval power compared to the Italians. It also, by the way, outperformed. This is sort of unknown, but the Italian submarines that served in the Atlantic from bases like La Rochelle actually outperformed the German U-boats in actual kills, its sinkings. This is a bit sort of all misunderstood. You see, if I provide with this narrative the things they have already said now to people in general, it's like it's a matter of probably of mental frailty. Like, if you frame something in a negative sense, people do not care about objectivizing the actual information. Naturally, here we're singling that out to show how sort of deficient the Italian Navy was compared to the British one in some aspects, and how this, of course, produced the Taranto defeat. But it's not like, in more objective basis, these were poorly performing forces at all, as the British also found out the hard way at some point. In any case, there is all a history to that, and why, for example, there were these technical shortcomings that can, where do you even start telling the story from, right? This is all connected with previous, let's say, post-World War I decision, in this case, fascist policy, about the armed forces and so on. So that's all for other videos, but always reflect on those, because they are, of course, producing in different countries different outcomes that eventually, when meeting literally in combat, produce also particular consequences. Now, the British Mediterranean fleet based in Alexandria included the carrier HMS Illustrious, which carried 36 Swordfish aircraft, each equipped with ASV. ASV means air-to-surface vessel radar, enabling effective nighttime operations. This is also very relevant. You can't see at night, naturally in very primitive ways to anything we are habituated today, but still in ways that do offer some edge on on equal ground. That is never an equal ground in war, but that can be also, in fact, pushing in your favor in any circumstance. Since 1936, Italy had been exploring radar technology by itself. As we said, actually, the Italian performance in science during the fascist era were radically advanced. But limited resources prevented these efforts from yielding practical results, right? It's what we're saying before about the propaganda, Oh my God, the Germans were such geniuses. You see, because of all the racial sort of hierarchy involved, it's just like all the things we said about World War I. Oh, well, Britain should have not gone at war with Germany. Because, why? Because you wanted the Germans to win World War I? Like, is it, your historical judgment is based on what ifs and on which basis, actually? The Italians had fierce technological capacities. They didn't have industrial ones that could translate the former into more widespread means. But remember that Barbarossa was carried out on muleback, all right? That's what more or less the standard, also the most advanced military in the world at the time. The Nazi one was actually about, so never commit the ridiculous mistake of thinking that technology matters. For example, think about Enigma, right? The British cracked the German cryptographical codes. They never broke the Italian ones, for example. But nobody cares because obviously Italy lost the war anyway, and so it didn't really matter, right? Italian radar research had been carried out. It had been led by the physicist Ugo Tiberio, who had developed a prototype EC3/Gufo radar, but only 2 units were operational by late 1940. Neither deployed at Taranto, by the way. The EC3 Gufo radar, operating at a frequency of 200 megahertz with a detection range of 30 kilometers for large ships, was limited by its bulky 2-meter antenna and slow scanning rate, rendering it ineffective for real-time combat, according to the same Tiberius technical reports. In any case, again, as important as radar were at this point in warfare, they were not either alone by themselves the major deal, right? There were many other factors that could have averted the Taranto disaster from the Italian side that did not entail radar. In any case, it was not until after the disastrous naval engagement at Cape Matapan on March the 28th, 1941, so that's some months ahead, that Germany supplied the Italian military with one of its radar systems. Additionally, the Regia Marina's general staff grappled with a persistent fuel shortage. By November 1940, Italy's naval fuel reserves stood at 1.7 million tons, but high consumption rates and limited imports from Germany and Romania, approximately 50,000 tons monthly, forced strict rationing. Italian industrialization was yet to sort of fully kick in. Italy became a fully industrialized country only by the 1950s, basically. So after the war, we'll talk more about these aspects. If anything, in the series, I want to start about contemporary and modern history from probably also a civilian standpoint. In any case, the aforementioned fuel shortage was exacerbated by Italy's dependence on low-grade Romanian oil with a sulfur content of 2.5%, which reduced engine efficiency by 10% compared to British naval fuel that was instead pretty good, as per Italian naval engineering analysis themselves. So again, everybody was kind of aware of all this, also by, shot down planes, by general espionage, etc. There was this broader awareness of also the general industrial productive capacities, the various technologies, the most straightforward ones, the ones that had, some of them were hidden at the time, and there was a lot of sort of interest for these hidden aspects. But at large, the foes knew pretty well about one another. Until the fall of 1941, pre-war fuel reserves in Italy supported regular, though curtailed operations, especially in training, always under the constant constraint of fuel conservation. After this period, the Regia Marina faced even tighter restrictions, forced to sparingly use the limited fuel supplies, Romanian oil and German synthetic fuels at that point provided by Hitler. While Italy's circumstances were far from optimal, the British faced their own difficulties as well. All right, we all sort of know that broader strategical, logistical constrictions of the Italians, still without, as we've seen, a solid industrial basis, some sort of belated war plans that were objectively, however, what basically the entire world that had started the war with, right? Most of these countries, actually all of them, were convinced that the time for the war would have been years ahead. Right? They entered in war much earlier in different circumstances. They had to quickly adapt to that. And in this case, actually, if you look at how Italy put itself in motion by 1943, where I was saying before, it was knocked out of the war for overall political reasons, other than, of course, the military defeats that had already taken place. It had sort of consistently geared up for a substantial military effort, because it was decided at that point that things had to go differently. It would have not saved, of course, nor the Axis nor Italy from defeat, but at least it was something you can evaluate on the longer term in terms of actual war readiness, that not everybody fully, reached at least at the same levels that even the same vituperated Italians did. All right. Now, the Italian fleet at Taranto was not an immediate threat to the British, as we explained, because the same Italians were relatively cautious, prudent. The British, there was this important balance, and the outcome of major engagements could have rapidly, of course, tilted the outcome of the Mediterranean theater in pretty drastic ways. So this was the problem. Like the Italians themselves were relatively sheltered, British too, but they remained a potential risk for one another, and especially the Italians had the naval upper hand, and this naturally made the British nervous. This situation demanded constant vigilance, requiring a cautious and sustained effort for the British to keep a large portion of their naval forces at the Egyptian port of Alexandria on high alert and under relentless pressure. And as we will see also at some point, given the raid on Alexandria, that was a quite immediate threat, because that was probably a direct response to the Taranto raid, as successful as, again, parallel to in terms of outcome and capacity. The British Mediterranean fleet's operations were constrained by the need to protect convoys to Malta, that, as you know, was to resist the Axis siege with enormous strains. We reminded our audience of that also in the video about the Knights of Malta video by comparing the Ottoman siege to the Axis one at some point. There were only 12 destroyers available for screening duties in November 1940 from the British side, limiting their ability to maintain a continuous blockade of Taranto. That the Italians could have also tried to break, of course. The British destroyer shortage was compounded by the reassignment of 3 destroyers to Gibraltar for Operation White on November the 8th, 1940, reducing the Mediterranean fleet's screening capacity by 1/4 according to Royal Navy operational records. Right, Operation White was basically the British attempt to deliver 14 aircrafts, 12 Hurricane fighters, and 2 squad fighter dive bombers to Malta from the aircraft carrier HMS Argus. And if anything, we will talk about that operation because it's quite fascinating and actually tied all with that. I also can't wait to actually talk about World War II planes. By the way, we made something about World War I, but at least the Hurricanes are some of my favorite in some ways. The real muse also of the Battle of Britain, as opposed to the more celebrated Spitfires that were not bad. I prefer the Messerschmitts, of course, for different reasons. The Bf 101 F4 1941 was just about to arrive in March of the following year. Here was the most beautiful plane of World War II. And just by balance, by relative circumstances, because of course aerial warfare was rapidly sort of changing, but it was, in my opinion, the best fighter of the war, and better than the Spitfire, as a matter of fact. Also, in the context of indeed the battle of Europe, of the battle against the British, etc. Now, the British High Command had been devising plans to attack the Italian fleet in Taranto since 1935, during Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. Again, in that video about Rome, we made under fashion, we talk about the broader international context. This is how important Taranto obviously was historically. There were times in which the Italian Navy had been properly capable of properly countering any other, especially at the end of the 19th century, where some naval technologies pioneered by the Italians that quite upset the British. And so there was, regardless of the general alignments, think about World War I, etc., like also was always this sense of, as we were saying before, also a sort of general racial ranking, contempt, belittlement, due to the fact that the Southern European power was actually a power among powers, and one that eventually was creating problems way more than envisaged in the broader context, which is the narrative that you don't hear about Italy during World War II, as if it had been a sort of irrelevant force. And that's a deep mistake. This has been actually academically understood, also probably in the international, including Anglo-American studies, that there's been a radical misunderstanding rather than mere underestimation of Italian power during World War II. If you're not familiar with the difference between these kind of definitions and what this, of course, historically equates to, it's difficult to explain now. We're not doing this, especially in this video. But again, as we're going to expand in World War II content, we will be more vocal about this. In 1938, amid the Munich diplomatic crisis, the British Royal Navy revisited these plans, because obviously the Axis was there, and the Germans and the Italians were to essentially, well, until the last, it was not really clear that Mussolini would actually go at war with Hitler. Churchill, for example, until 1943, still, and even when in fact the British and Italians were killing each other, was convinced that he could have Mussolini passing properly from the Allied side in ways that, again, are also quite controversial in this regard, but naturally would have helped the broader Allied situation at some point. And so it's this ambiguity that, however, at a strictly strategical level is pre-planned. I mean, there were major plans that could not, like just in World War I, for example, could not take into consideration everything, but generally speaking, right, especially the Italian Navy could not be ignored in a global warfare at that point, in the broader strategic balance of the same. And the British, by the late 30s, had thus also developed a daring and innovative approach, which goes much to their credit. The Theory Swordfish, a biplane torpedo bomber designed for carrier operations with foldable canvas wings, was deemed capable of executing nighttime bombing missions. Naturally, these were always daring actions, to say the least. And it wasn't the most advanced of the planes at the time, but it was fairly well, calibered for this kind of theater and operations. The Swordfish's Mark 12 torpedo, fitted with a magnetic detonator, was specially modified to run at a depth of 10.5 meters, ensuring it could navigate Taranto's shallow harbor without striking the bottom, and so ensuring the delivery of the explosive on target. The Mark 12 torpedo's duplex magnetic contact pistol, introduced in 1939, particularly increased its hit probability by a fifth in shallow waters compared to standard contact torpedoes, as detailed in British Ordnance testing data. So this whole thing had been calibrated properly for Taranto's harbor by the British, and quite understandably so. This capability would enable the surprise assault on Taranto's port under the cover of darkness. Training for this groundbreaking tactic began immediately. Despite its outdated design and slow speed of only 230 kilometers per hour, the Swordfish was highly maneuverable with good range, able to release torpedoes at a mere 5.5 meters above sea level and perform precise dive bombing attacks. So they're really slow, big, sort of, windbags of some sort, but they are well structured for this specific task, which will essentially succeed also because of surprise and the paucity of Italian defenses. Capacity, especially also at night, as you understand, are complicated, but mostly the lack of an effective aerial screening of the Taranto base. These capabilities of the Swordfish had already, by the way, been tested in actual combat during Germany's invasion of France. Besides, Italy itself had already faced a nighttime Swordfish attack on Sicilian fuel depots. So there was already, of course, an important experience from the side of the British pilots. There was an Italian saying mutuated from the Latin "fortuna audaces juvat," that is, fortune favors the bold, right? Rewards the courageous, which had been part of the Italian fascist rhetoric of sort of humanity and this hyper, sense of virtue, of determination, of guts. And paradoxically, this is what essentially the British will, of course, in a universally military, continuous foundation, prove themselves to master on this occasion. On the night of November 11 to 12, 1940, the fiery Swordfish achieved its most iconic triumph of the war, by the way, because also aerial warfare, again, left these earlier aircrafts behind. The same Italians, of course, stepped up. They surpassed things like CR-32s, but again, we're in 1940 now. Now, the Swordfish crews showcased at Taranto not only resolve and bravery, but also exceptional training. All right? What is beautiful about warfare, so to say, is that that everything can go wrong at every time, but training in the right measure ensures almost this cathartic acceptation of risk, meaning that if you do everything right, and of course there is always something going wrong, doesn't matter how much you try, but if you stick to the essentials, right, and you essentially fulfill your duty, what is being planned, the chances to make it, of course, increase. Like your only chance to increase, again, the probability of getting out of there alive, succeeding, and so having made this all worthwhile is, of course, to stick to that performance. The 21 Swordfish used in the attack were drawn from 813 and 815 squadrons, with pilots trained specifically for low-altitude night attacks at the Royal Navy's base in Halfar, Malta. These pilots underwent a rigorous 120-hour training program focused on night navigation and torpedo drops, achieving a 95% success rate in simulated shallow water attacks, as recorded in Royal Navy training logs. It's really an impressive mission, all right? It really requires a lot of nerves, a sense of orientation. Paradoxically, the most difficult things to maintain in aerial warfare is proper order, cohesion, right? And remember that at this time also communications are incredibly limited. You mostly go by sighting. Here, radar, of course, helps a big deal, but at large, it's a very risky business in properly empirical terms. Now, these British pilots' qualities transformed a seemingly unremarkable and technologically obsolete aircraft like the Swordfish into a formidable weapon, achieving one of World War II's most remarkable feats, a mission recorded in history as the first naval battle won without the opposing fleets ever sighting each other. Think about that. I recently made a video about Midway that for some reason nobody watched. We must change this, right? You can't presume that history can be learned just by watching in every video that has an ethnic migration era title in it, right? It's ridiculous, right? This is not history. This is just a joke, right? Just children reasoning those terms. If you don't study these things, you can't even understand the migration era for that matter. And of course, vice versa. But the context here is deeply educational, properly from a strategical point of view, right? Taranto, the night of November 11th, 1940, declared Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, will always be remembered as evidence that Navy's air arm is its most destructive asset, which still largely holds true, at least depending on sort of different circumstances, but doctrinally throughout most of the time up today. And in fact, these were not mere words, right? For years, the Royal Navy's maritime supremacy had relied on its battleships and crews, right? So probably naval gunnery and maneuvering, right? But on that November night, the courage and initiative of a small group of naval aviators in the open cockpits of their Swordfish biplanes heralded a new chapter in naval warfare. One that, in fact, started very quietly, at least as we'll see now. It wouldn't be quite a quiet night, nor the consequences of that would be characterized by silence, really. Given that, as you know, the raid on Taranto will, as we'll see later, better also inspire the Japanese one at Pearl Harbor, right? So actually turning back against the Allies in even worse ways. But this is literally the first type of engagement where really aerial warfare successfully scores a major naval victory. And again, we've seen it with Midway. That was just, again, more than a year away. That was the instantiation of the already full development of those kind of aeronaval tactics and strategies, by the way. As is often the case, really fortune does favor the daring. Taranto's defenses included 101 anti-aircraft guns and 193 machine guns, typically supported by 87 barrage balloons that suspended steel cables to block low-altitude flights. This is pretty typical World War II military horizon, like landscape. On November the 11th, however, only 27 balloons remained, as 60 had been destroyed by strong winds 5 days earlier and could not be replaced due to a shortage of hydrogen. This is interesting in a number of ways, but the hydrogen shortage was due to Italy's limited industrial capacity, producing only 1,200 cubic meters of hydrogen daily in 1940. Insufficient to replace the lost balloons, according to Italian military logistics reports. But in general, this tells you, even in southern Italy, in the Mediterranean, like autumn weather is not overly mild or simply stable, right? So this, as a whole, I have had, of course, as an operation, had been also meteorologically planned. But there were sort of lots of question marks regarding, in fact, how much could there be, for example, to stop, as we've seen with the barrage balloons, the British attempts at night. That's deadly, right? And there still were, by the way. We'll see also what kind of losses the British took and how. In any case, the submerged anti-torpedo nets intended to protect the Taranto harbor's ships covered only 1/3 of the port's 12,800 meter entrance due to a planned artillery exercise. This was also just random, all right? So this is why fortune favors the bold, because you cannot achieve victory. This is straightforward traditional theology without fortune, without luck, right? All the greatest victories in the history of mankind were achieved, say, thanks to luck. Not that luck was 50 plus 1%, but it could be literally that plus 1 over 50% of other things that really makes the thing, right? And this was in part also the case, because even one thing that had gone in a different way would have literally changed maybe the overall success of the operation. Two additional issues rendered the aforementioned Italian nets largely ineffective. They did not, in fact, extend to the seabed, allowing British torpedoes about 60 centimeters of clearance below their already anticipated depth, and Admiral Campioni ordered them positioned away from the ships to enable a swift departure without waiting for the barriers to be cleared. That was a mistake, right? So the Italians were ready to spring out of Taranto with their ships, and they were careless about this protection, because they thought at least that the British did not, this is also the point, they did not have really the capacity to carry out something like that. When you look at these things in sort of military historical hindsight, you realize that, of course, today we know not just what happened at Taranto, but what kind of capability aeronaval warfare would reach in exactly at this point and widely later in World War II and beyond. But at the time, nobody had really achieved this, right? So it's not like the British were saying, okay, well, simply walking in, right? They didn't know whether this thing would succeed, right? This is the entire point of why the thing is actually carried out to begin with. There are all these sort of problems, this hampering, let's say, all the various attempts that at large, in their combination, and for whatever can go on, cannot be properly predicted in terms of actual outcome in this result. Now, the nets, by the way, this is very important, because at the end of the day, the British could have also made the raid, etc., but the torpedoes not worked, right? And there were issues. We've seen that with the magnetic devices also at Midway, that largely there was a bloodbath in the first wave of U.S. Aircrafts that basically brought to nothing. At least that would, as an heterogenesis of the end, bring to some important consequences later in favor of the Americans. But in that moment, they lost a lot of planes and a lot of pilots. And that was big, by the way. But getting to the Italian nets again, constructed of 100 millimeter steel mesh, were designed to stop torpedoes running at a depth of 8 meters. The British had calibrated their torpedoes to exploit the aforementioned gap. So the British torpedoes' shallow run was achieved through a modified release mechanism that maintained a 10-degree nose-up angle during descent, ensuring stable trajectory at 10.5 meters as per Royal Ordnance specifications. These are very, as you understand, very specifically calibrated measures that, yes, can be tested again at home, but you will never fully know amidst all these varying factors whether they're even going to work. But hadn't they thought of doing this, the British would have not even achieved this result. Later accused of excessive caution, Campioni's intent to prepare for combat in this instance evidently backfired. So let's look at the British brilliant assault. The British, as we were saying, did encounter significant obstacles as well. Not everything, of course, went as planned, to say the least. Their initial plan targeted Taranto, first of all, not for the night of November the 11th, but of October the 21st, which was, by the way, the anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And the reason why, by the way, this could say there was always the risk of being discovered also by intelligence, there was a broader risk that things could also worsen in terms of weather and more. 36 Swordfish should have been at that point in October launched from the carriers Illustrious and Eagle. But really something wrong happened because an accidental fire on one aircraft forced a postponement. And by the way, it's not even that frequent to have a fire simply happening like that. In any case, just before the rescheduled date, yet another mechanical issue sidelined, this time the Eagle carrier, reducing the Swordfish force to 24 aircraft, so 2/3. Besides, of these 24, 3 would not be deployed either, so it fell to 21 units. The Eagle's withdrawal was due to contaminated aviation fuel, which caused engine failures in 5 aircraft during pre-mission tests. Right. So we said before that the British had the best fuel, but yeah, these things can happen, even if they had better fuel than the Italians, and this delayed their initial attack. The contaminated fuel with a water content of 0.3% led engine misfires in 20% of test flights, as documented in the Royal Navy maintenance reports. So, as I understand, there are lots of issues popping up, and the attack, dubbed Operation Judgment, by the way, which is sort of quite meaningful because it says like this is really a test for the whole enterprise as seen against an enemy that at that point we're really mindful of, and that may as well take the upper hand, was delayed by 2 additional days as well. Proceeding with a force reduced by 1/3 was a high-stakes gamble in general. Of course, there is an optimum that is in warfare connected with the sake of simplicity, of unity of command. The larger the force, the easier it could be spotted, or the more disorderly could have been employed. Plus, again, carriers, as we've seen, have just their limits. They can't have their own accidents as well. Failure would have alerted the Regia Marina to the Royal Navy's new aerial offensive capabilities that, as we just explained, were kind of at least untested at the time. The Italians were aware that such stuff was being sort of geared up, but in general, until it happened, nobody really knew whether it would succeed. And again, had the British failed at Taranto, the Italians would have definitely taken adequate countermeasures, and so there would have not been a chance to do it again in the same circumstances. However, the British delay paradoxically also allowed for improved reconnaissance, verifying the presence of a substantial Italian naval force in Taranto itself, including the newly commissioned battleships Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, and 4 modernized battleships. We mentioned them before: the Giulio Cesare, Caio Duilio, Andrea Doria, and Cavour. These, by the way, are all famous names of, say, Julius Caesar. Caius Duilius was the guy who triumphed at sea during the Punic Wars. Andrea Doria was a famous Genoese admiral of the Renaissance. Cavour was after the prime minister during the Italian unification. So we're not talking about the Littorio. It was the symbol, the Littorian axe of the same fascist Italy. Vittorio Veneto had been the last the Italian victory over the Austro-Hungarians in 1918 that brought an end to the victory on the Italian front. So, by the way, the fascists had a very good propaganda machine, right? They were excellent in this kind of psychological, like through cinema, through music, this kind of references to classical and the more recent Italian past. This blow also hit exactly there. And of course, well, every country had, if you look at Pearl Harbor, of course, the ships sunk were quite much tied to the heart of the United States imagery, symbolism, identity. So there are important issues here going on, just like it would happen at Alexandria, with 2 battleships knocked out from the British side. Now, a reconnaissance was conducted by Maryland aircraft from Malta, which photographed, that recently as we've seen, the Italian fleet's disposition on literally November the 10th, so basically the day before, and confirming the ship's exact position in the Mar Grande. This Maryland aircraft, equipped with F-24 cameras, captured images at the resolution of 0.5 meters per pixel, enabling precise identification of ship classes and positions according to the Royal Air Force reconnaissance records. And yes, by the way, pixels, if you don't know, date back to 1839. They're not digital stuff. They're also in the analogical. Anyway, Italian observers on land had even actually spotted British reconnaissance planes on that occasion, but lacking radar, could not detect the enemy fleet they were scouting. All right, so that seemed just like, yeah, okay, this is an obvious target. They're spying on us, whatever, but is a major attack actually underway? There were, by the way, many ways to look at this, like the Japanese, went literally to Pearl Harbor, and different Japanese agents to Pearl Harbor to literally take pictures of the harbor that closed. And again, generally speaking, the British had that from previous years, but this was very new imagery. Departing from HMS Illustrious in radio silence, important, and without navigation lights to evade detection, which is risky for the same safety of the formation, by the way, the Swordfish flew 170 nautical miles at night to drop torpedoes and bombs on the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers anchored in Taranto. This is a big deal for the means of the time. It's scary, right? To do something with the technology of the era like that without any other sort of, of course, knowing what awaited them also in AA countermeasures, etc., like, takes massive attributes. The port attacks were rapid, sudden, and unanticipated. The squadron launched in 2 waves, thundering through the darkness toward a target over 2 hours away. The first wave of 12 Swordfish approached from the southwest at 10:58 p.m., splitting into 2 groups after losing contact, by the way. Flares lit up the night sky above the Italian ships, guiding the torpedo bombers to begin their dives amid a barrage of anti-aircraft fire, which, as we've seen, were basically the port's sole defense, given the absence of close air support from the Regia Aeronautica. The flares dropped by 2 Swordfish equipped with 250-pound bombs that were pretty sizable. As you know, this is also what heavy bombers often used. I think the 250s at this point were maybe the large. But in any case, they were pretty heavy. Like the Stukas themselves, fatigued to carry that, and staying, balanced in some ways. And some of these bombs were just, thrown by Heinkel's 111s. And these bombs, first of all, they're also a bit more complicated. They were timed to burn for 3 minutes, illuminating the harbor for precise targeting. And these flares, Mark V models, emitted 500,000 candela, providing visibility up to 5 kilometers in clear conditions, and specified in Royal Navy Ordnance manuals. So immediately, imagine these bombers immediately lighten up the whole picture as far as especially their action was concerned over this literal titans of the sea. I mean, there was a massive, but I mean really a massive Italian naval power under them. And in just 10 minutes, the Italian fleet suffered immense damage as a consequence. The battleship Littorio, Caio Duilio, and Conte di Cavour, along with 4 smaller vessels, were severely damaged, and some shore facilities were destroyed. The Littorio was struck by 3 torpedoes, 2 hitting the bow and 1 the stern, causing flooding that required dry dock repairs. The Littorio's flooding was exacerbated by its inadequate compartmentalization, with only 12 watertight compartments compared, for example, to the 20 on British battleships, as noted in Italian naval design critiques. I mean, it was not the end of the world, but definitely for the people who died in the ship, because as a direct consequence of that, obviously did matter quite a lot. Now, only 1 attacking aircraft was downed. The second wave, this was the first wave. The second wave arrived around midnight, so basically 1 hour later. At this point, easily navigating past the remaining barrage balloons' steel cables, comprising just 8 aircraft, 5 torpedo bombers, and 3 bombers, as one was grounded by a malfunction, by the way. The wave struck the Caio Duilio and Cavour again, along with the cruiser Taranto, at the cost of 1 additional British aircraft lost. The Cavour was hit by a single torpedo below the waterline, flooding its forward magazines and causing it to settle on the harbor bottom. The Cavour's forward magazines contained 120 tons of 320mm ammo, and the flooding caused a 15-degree list, rendering it inoperable, according to the same Regia Marina damage reports. The final Royal Air Force aircraft landed on the Lustrious at 2:39 a.m. Italian casualties numbered 59 dead and 600 wounded. The Cavour was so badly damaged that it never returned to service, while the Caio Duilio and Littorio required 6 months of repairs. You understand the ratio here. It's not even just a matter of manpower. It's probably about the strategic relevance that these ships really had. Now, as I was reminding at the beginning of the video, that there are other channels that say, well, but if you look at it from a strictly material point of view, the Italians repaired some of the ships overall. Like, again, things did not really change too much in material terms during the course of the war, morally. And consequently, also from an actual strategical point of view, because even that theoretical element does represent a quantity, if we're not talking about, of course, how much inspirational this was for the British on the other side, this was a crushing blow to the Regia Marina. All right? One from which, again, it would be able to rise again, but that was also really globally wise, a bit of a demonstration of Italian weakness. Inspiring, as we've seen, also other attacks for its effectiveness, and including, again, the ones of the same axis. Nevertheless, in the Mediterranean, this was a unique attack. There would be nothing like this afterwards during the war. It was of enormous help for the British, underscoring the British superiority and the formidable obstacles Italian ships would face throughout the naval war. Yet, just 15 days after the night of Taranto, as we were hinting at before, the surviving ships ventured out to engage the same British fleet south of Cape Teulada. We are on November the 27th, repeatedly hitting the heavy cruiser Berwick. The Berwick sustained 2 8-inch shell hits from the heavy cruiser Fiume, damaging its forward turret and forcing it to withdraw for repairs. The Fiume's 8-inch guns, with a muzzle velocity of 900 meters per second, delivered shells with a penetration capacity of 150 millimeters of armor at 15 kilometers, as per Italian naval gunnery data. Contrary to British propaganda as well, the Swordfish torpedo bombers did not actually shatter the Regia Marina's morale, per se. The Italian Navy was, of course, very aware of its own capacities, and they realized that even though they had suffered an important blow, this did not really mark the naval warfare per se. The Mediterranean War undeniably began for Italy anyhow under the most foreboding conditions. And there was much, again, to be proven again to show that, in fact, the Italian Navy was capable of taking on the British one, also in successful ways. We can look at different aspects of this entire picture, and if anything, I'm probably going to make a series about the Taranto raid because it's even more complex than what we have actually depicted. We can explain some aspects of this. First of all, in naval warfare, a fleeting being, as the Italian one at Taranto, is a naval force that exerts influence without leaving its port, as losses in battle could be irreplaceable, rendering the fleet ineffective. By staying in port, it forces the enemy to maintain constant surveillance, by the way. The term originated in 1690 when Lord Torrington, commanding the Royal Navy in the English Channel, faced a stronger French fleet. He advocated avoiding combat unless conditions were highly favorable until the balance of power shifted. I happened to study that campaign, especially on land, very intensely. Back in the day, this is just random, but it happens when you spend too much time studying warfare. This is, in any case, another story. In fact, there wasn't much. At least the English managed to only harass the various French ports as a reprisal. There was also the Luxembourg thing. In any case, we're talking about this in another circumstance. Meanwhile, this fleet in being posed a persistent threat, compelling the French to conduct exhausting patrols and limiting their initiative elsewhere at the same time. Because, of course, when you have large naval forces, just like any large military forces facing one another, the odds are balanced. So you can't simply, even when you have the upper hand at a point, simply just give up the initiative, right, and allowing the enemy to do what simply wants. We've seen this also at the Battle of Cape Teulada. The British took it from the Italians. For not talking about the raid on Alexandria that was, again, equally devastating to the one of Taranto. The attack strategy was straightforward yet remarkably effective. In 1940, British torpedo bombers hit the Italian port in 2 consecutive waves, following parallel paths that swept through the harbor, inflicting severe damage on the Regia Marina. In just 90 minutes, half of Italy's battleships, that were the pride, again, of also the Italian armed forces that were really immense in technical development, in just cost, firepower, etc., were disabled. So in the moment, that was also pretty significant material damage. The attack's success was aided by the use of, as we've seen, duplex pistols in the British torpedoes, which allowed detonation either in contact or magnetically, increasing their effectiveness against the Italian ships' hulls. The duplex pistols' magnetic field had a sensitivity of half Gauss, ensuring detonation within 2 meters of a ship's hull, enhancing damage by almost 1/3 compared to contact-only torpedoes as per British ordnance tests. Admiral Inigo Campione, born in Viareggio on November 14, 1878, is also an interesting figure. This, again, commanders of really of another era, if you think about them from today's perspective, as we still think somehow World War II to be close, but actually all their veterans are basically dead by now, and so it's not that close as it could be, I don't know, just knowing our grandparents and being born just half a century after that, right? Well, Campione ascended the military ranks to become a fleet admiral and commander of the Taranto Bay's fleet, which, as we've seen, was a huge deal, to say the least. Like other senior Italian naval officers, he was acutely aware of the Royal Navy's formidable challenge. Right. So again, this varnishing of incompetence, of underestimation, of buffoonery that is normally tailored over the Italians during World War II. I mean, it's something you could easily do in the same ways. I don't know. People think that the Japanese were that competent. The Japanese were incredibly incompetent in the broader picture. Like, you can't argue that the Germans themselves were the best army out there, but the broader strategical choices were at some point deleterious. So what is the actual degree of objectivity in the evaluation of certain, if anything, of certain specific circumstances? Of course, these powers were not equivalent, and the Italians definitely had huge problems. However, not much connected with the incompetence of their military. Right, their military essentially followed what the political guidance was, that in many ways was that reckless and incompetent. Of course, you can't separate simply politics from the military, from society. It's all one with that. But as we'll see also in other videos, the notion that the Italian command as such was incompetent, or that was made of people that didn't know how to make it. It's not really a historical. It was never really actually considered as a historical thing. It's I presume, historiographically, this was never fully assessed at any level. Campione here was approached war, and to this specific one was cautious, yet also open to attacking under favorable conditions. It was an interesting mitigation of this. He was a sort of withdrawn individual that, however, aimed at this eventually stingy strikes, as also was to be witnessed during the war. Besides, at this point, Campione had been criticized already for excessive caution after the Battle of Punta Stillo that had been fought on July the 9th, 1940. So he was relieved of command shortly after Taranto, because the latter's defeat seemed just too much to bear, and his name was too much tied to that debacle. Appointed governor of Rhodes, however, it was controlled by the Italians. Campione remained loyal to the king, Victor Emmanuel III, after September the 8th, 1943. This is interesting. We'll talk about the phase. Nobody really discusses this in serious terms, in my opinion. Probably not even the Italians, because there is a huge political, historiographical, and broader cultural premise that we should make when we talk about Italian military history during World War II also, right? Because sometimes we also start from the assumption that somehow Italians don't matter in how they describe World War II. Instead, they have an important historiography that, however, has a very peculiar way of looking at the whole thing that naturally escapes for sophistication most sort of international approach to the story. And the approach to the story, again, is by general center, again, Italy sucked, and who does even care, right? The problem is that the Italians had never really come that much forth in openly studying their own World War II. And so lacking, as we've seen, for example, also in the videos about medieval Italian warfare, that kind of straightforward definition in sort of objective rather than accurate terms of enormous topics like this one. Besides, as I said at the beginning, in 2025, we cannot say that even though the war ended 80 years ago, and lots has been written about that this lot has actually been framed, say, been organized, has been properly conceived in a coherent, exhaustive in-depth, sort of comprehensive fashion. Right? There's none of this about World War II. Right? You find isolated studies and cluster studies on this or that general, mostly from a military point of view. There is, of course, a lot written, obviously, about Hitler, about Mussolini, but in many ways, this is done still mostly through a lens that is either too overly military specialized about only certain specific theaters and scenarios, and especially from an Anglo-American point of view, that naturally was the most prolific from a historical point of view, a bit too carrying that kind of normal, kind of empirical, descriptive rather than strictly analytical and critical view of these events. Because after all, there is this kind of sense of safety of having won the war and describing what happened from some sort of perceivedly moral upper hand, which in a sense, should be there because, of course, you can't talk about, I don't know, Nazi fascism without looking at what this also politically entailed and how they had gotten there, what they did throughout the war. By the way, there is the Italians did extremely ferocious things during not just World War II, but also before. They were probably inventors of concentration camps. I mean, some say also the British did before with the Boers, but that's not so important. I mean, that the moral judgment, for example, of the Germans for Nazism, that is sort of disproportionately as overwhelmingly portrayed everywhere. Basically, especially Americans have literally a Freudian issue with National Socialism. It's something actually also embarrassing to witness on a daily basis, but unfortunately, like, this mostly depends on the fact that the world is populated by lesser people in every country, so that's the normal wave of sort of pop cultural, subcultural kind of reaction to these things. But in that sense, in fact, Italy is the main, say, problem in assessing an Italian historical, say, an historical objectivity on Italy during World War II is exactly the fact that Italy was never taken seriously, right? Most of what they did also under fascism was just either discredited as mere something merely clownesque, and or maybe not even so dangerous or damaging. And again, there were many reasons for this. Think about after the war, even just the American presidential elections in the later phase, how important the vote of Italian Americans were, and how, in this sense, it was important to treat Italy well, which was obviously, just like West Germany, necessary, right? Probably there was, at some point, a deliberate decision to say that the Germans had to be depicted. They had to be restored the lost honor because, of course, Bond was important in the Cold War, in the Boer Band. This is kind of obvious, right? I mean, you can't blame. This is actually a very positive thing. The fact that, for example, the Germans, the Italians, but also the Japanese became some of the richest and longest living people in the world after World War II, as opposed to what happened to the sort of the winners, quote unquote winners from the eastern side of the Allies. So it's a lot of stuff. Like, if you really want to look at the roots of contemporary West, you can't but unavoidably pass through the way World War II was described. And this is a topic that I really like for many reasons. And I would really like to explore more in Schwerpunkt, because it feels like at least most of what I look at out there. Of course, YouTube is very popular indeed, and you can find literally everything on it. But it's almost the repetition of the same things. It's just like, okay, let's make this video on. I mean, if you look at most, I haven't searched for that. Let me give a look to it. The raid on Taranto is fairly famous in general, not least because it was also an important British victory. Raid on Taranto. Well, there is a lot, as a matter of fact, which is, again, unlike some other videos that I often complain about and this is mostly because it's British history as opposed to Italian history, you see. If I search about these other battles or anything like, I don't know, Italian victories during World War II, there's basically nothing, or it's presented mostly as a shocker of some sort. You must make the premise, or it's so fleshly, say, okay, click on it because you've never heard of that, those kind of things, but there is not much of a bedrock of sort of systematic critical information capable of properly analyzing the whole. Right, it's mostly like a football team kind of cheering where you have different sides, different flags. And it's just, let's look at, the times that this country did well so that, the people who root for that for some reason can feel that sort of fuzzy feeling of, okay, look, we also did something. This is not a serious way of telling military history. And we also must be very, very objective, right? We were actually this is really a big digression, but we're talking about Admiral Campioni. This was a guy who refused to surrender to the Germans after the armistice. That's an incredibly, important and incredibly interesting phase of Italian history during World War II. And so basically, he ended up, as most Italian military, captured by the Germans, who handed him over to the same Mussolini. And rejecting the Italian Social Republic, that was essentially the Nazi-fascist puppet state that Hitler created for Mussolini in northern Italy, because, as you know, the country was divided in two, basically, after the armistice. From one side, you had the Allies, the other, the Germans. Campioni was tried for high treason, sentenced to death, and executed by firing squad in Parma on May the 2nd, 1944. And this actually is an incredibly important statement because of also the relation of Italians with... these were all fascists in the sense that, of course, if you were in Italy at the time and you were not in a grave, in prison or in exile, you had to be a fascist. There was no other way around. But in that critical juncture where you had to really show your colors in deciding whether to stand your ground or surrender, Campioni not just decided to stand his ground, but even when defeated, he was to die by essentially a fascist regime from which he had basically distanced himself, remaining loyal to the king as opposed to fascism at that point. It's a bit of a complicated history if you know how Mussolini was literally removed from power and how fascism literally disbanded itself from July 1943. But it's just for saying, remember that there is that sort of redeeming quality of an important part of Italy that is, in that sense, the only true escape from fascism in a way. In an objectively messy Italian way, right? But one that, for example, you don't find by the same scale, for example, for Germany or for other countries. And so you would like to appreciate it. Always remembering that Italy did not have a Nuremberg trial, for example, nor Japan for that matter. So, the Germans in particular were very much like the straw man used by the Italians to claim some sort of moral upper hand. While looking at fascism, you realize that, there is much to say about that at least. Now, other very important connection that I was seeing here just in the thumbnails of the videos, that's how the British told the Japanese to make Pearl Harbor, right? That's basically the only thing, but it's actually, you want to appreciate this in a broader Mediterranean, European, and also global dimension, right? It's not just because, usual Italians sucked, and then look at the Japanese, what they did instead. There is also a dimension you want to appreciate for probably the original context. from both sides, naturally. But, of course, the Japanese Taranto-Pearl Harbor connection is mandatory for a video like this. In fact, notoriously, the Imperial Japanese Navy meticulously analyzed the Battle of Taranto while they were already planning the Pearl Harbor attack, which happened 1 year later, as you know, and which shared Taranto's, by the way, like probably the Bay of Pearl Harbor, shared Taranto's shallow water characteristics. Japanese Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito, assistant to the naval attaché in Berlin, traveled to Taranto to investigate the British attack firsthand. In October 1941, Naito, so it took a while, right, almost 1 year for NATO to report to Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Japanese assault on December 7, 1941. We missed Pearl Harbor's video. On Schwerpunkt, we really must do that as well. And NATO's report detailed the British use of shallow-running torpedoes and nighttime tactics, prompting the Japanese to modify their Type 91 torpedoes with wooden fins to ensure stable shallow runs in Pearl Harbor's 12-meter deep waters. It's interesting to think about NATO, I don't know, sitting somewhere in Taranto eating spaghetti or something, well, taking notes on this entire, gathering a substantial amount of evidence from the Italians about the British attack. The Type 91, let's say, torpedoes' wooden fins reduce its dive depth by 1.5 meters, achieving a stable run at 10 meters, as confirmed by Japanese naval trials in September 1941. Perhaps more notably, a Japanese military delegation visited Taranto in May 1941, holding extensive discussions with the Regia Marina officers. Again, this is an encounter we want to see. Imagine the interpreters and the Italians and Japanese looking at one another, say, what the hell are we doing in the Axis here? Now, for the Japanese, the idea of an air naval attack on a port was not novel, at least theoretically. Since early 1939, they had been studying solutions for attacking shallow water ports themselves, including, by the way, Manila, Singapore, Vladivostok, and, of course, Pearl Harbor itself. And, of course, this was even more relevant if you understand the broader Japanese strategy and doctrine as far as this, at least, attacks on portable fleets. The Japanese delegation, led by Captain Mitsuo Abe, observed the damage to the Littorio and Cavour, noting first-hand the effectiveness of low-altitude torpedo drops in overcoming harbor defenses. The Japanese delegation's report emphasized that the British attack succeeded to a 90% torpedo hit rate within 400 meters of the target, a precision achieved through the Swordfish's slow speed and low altitude approach, as recorded in Imperial Japanese Navy archives. This is, again, incredibly interesting because it, again, there is all a technicality behind this. If anything, today's video could browse just in overview, but again, we will look at this surely in more technical terms, probably in a series dedicated to Taranto's raid, that, however, will be part of a much more extensive World War II content that we have to craft in a way or another. So I was actually very glad to do this. There is also probably going to be more, we will sort of Axis warfare. We have probably to start Soviet warfare, but for some reason I was trying to prevent this. If anything, we'll talk about, in any case, more contemporary warfare of other kind, because that there is the embarrassment of the choice for really the amount of military history we can cover. I was noticing, by the way, that contemporary warfare content has skyrocketed. We are at a 63. This is the 64th video, and most of this has been done just in the last year. This is extremely interesting. I'm particularly glad to have done this, and we have now some aeronaval warfare Because for aerial warfare, we have already 3 videos, and I want to make a 4th one, by the way, which is, surely we have, I made a video about the German U-boats. This was among the first that, again, there is a lot to cover, which doesn't begin or end here, of course, and so we can't just say, let's go at it. This is also the 12th video of British warfare, even though we didn't fully dedicate too much about that proper, because this playlist, of course, contain I don't know, for example, the series on the Kaiserschlacht or the one on the Crimean War. So obviously that entails British warfare because they were the British from the other side among the others, right? But I would like to do something more about British warfare. I would like, for example, to cover the Mesopotamian campaign in World War I, which was incredibly brutal. There was the Siege of Kut that was really something. But in any case, again, we have just embarrassment of the choice. We'll talk also more about Italian warfare because, as we explained in this video, it really deserves. And it's really fascinating also to see it in relation to, for example, the British one, because it's such an underrated overall confrontation, I think, in World War II. And it's incredibly romantic in many ways, even looking at the historical relations between Italy and Britain in different circumstances, probably also in World War I. If anything, that's mostly like the Americans, okay, that connected with that. But who hasn't read The Farewell to Arms, right? But there is still, by fighting on both sides, there's a lot of course, like the British fought in Italy too in World War I, and for Italy and for the broader cause. And yet, again, it's interesting to see also how, for example, this continental country spiraled into fascism, why and how, and that's something that requires much more than just military history, and that's why we are kind of here to, of course, assess things in sort of deeper fashion. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.